Hello friends, Buddy here at House of Props, and in today's build video I decided to make Saruman's staff to accompany the Gandalf the Whites Staff I made a few weeks ago. It's a 3D printed staff and it contains an aluminum rod for support, but it also adds some weight, not much, only about 2 pounds, but that little extra weight makes it feel more realistic in the hand. Another feature I added was making the orb out of resin. Now this is a technique I haven't used a lot before, but I'll show you the steps I used to do it, and I'm pretty happy with the final results. Now, as you may know, I try to make my props as film realistic as possible, and I found that there are a few discrepancies with the version of the staff from United Cutlery. First, the orb is too round, and second, they made the shaft as a straight rod with a beveled end. This isn't the case for the actual prop. The shaft has a taper to it and features a sort of ring nub about 10 inches from the bottom. This detail picture from Weta is from the Hobbit films, which made me wonder if changes had been made to the staff from the original. So I went looking at the scene where Gandalf consults Saruman, and it was clear that the staff had the taper to it. But what about that nub? I scoured footage and photos but couldn't find anything concrete. Until I spotted it in the fight scene between the wizards. At this point, the ring catches the light, showing that there is truly a nub about 10 inches up from the bottom. So let me show you the process I used to try and make the most screen accurate version of Saruman's staff possible. Let's get started. Since this design is very geometric, I was able to completely create the files in AutoCAD, which works great for projects like these, but not as well with organic designs. Then the pieces were printed, and I had to split the fins into 3 pieces. I tried to make it 2, but they were too tall and would wobble as it printed, so it was better just to split it. And the shaft pieces have a taper to it, so keeping the 7 pieces in order is important. For the top of the staff, I printed the pieces with a layer height of 0.09 on my Elegoo Neptune 3 Pro, and since it is such a thin layer height, cleanup will be pretty easy and straightforward. To start, I use a 120 grit pad on my hand sander to begin to remove what little bit of print lines are visible. Then I switch to some 180 grit and repeat the process of sanding against the grain. I'm doing it by hand, but you could switch out pads on the sander if you wanted. While I do that, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button, if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help this channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you will be notified when new projects are released. Thank you. After the 180 grit, I switched to some 220. And you're probably saying, Buddy, why are you sanding the pieces so much? And the answer I would give is, Saruman's staff is meant to be a really smooth, shiny black lacquer finish, and by starting with a low number and working our way up, we can achieve a finish that doesn't look 3D printed. Next, I switched from the 220 to some 400. This step will really smooth the surface, so if you run over the surface with your fingernail, you shouldn't feel any striations in the print. I've had people ask me why not just use an acetone bath for the smoothing, and I've answered that I'm not happy with the results an acetone bath yields. I went into more detail about this in my Praetorian helmet build, where I even show photos explaining why the technique isn't appropriate for highly accurate prop making. You can check that out if you're interested in more detail. At this point, I started assembly. The fins received some supports made from 1.5 inch pieces of 1/8 inch dowel, or in my case, I'm just using some bamboo skewers I was able to get from the dollar store. To attach the supports and the pieces, I squeezed some CA glue into the holes and on some of the surface. Then I add a little E6000 to the spots where I didn't place the CA glue. The dowel can be inserted, the other piece can be aligned, and take care to make sure the edges are flush. Then zip kicker can be dripped onto the CA glue, which will cure it in a split second. And the same process can be repeated with the third fin piece. The reason for the 2 glues is because the CA glue dries faster and allows building to continue, and the E6000 will remain flexible when cured, so it'll not split as easily, meaning seams will not split open over time from use. With the fins assembled, I assemble the piece they snap into. Squeeze some CA glue into the hole and insert the support peg. Then the second piece gets CA glue in the hole, and then it can be slid onto the peg. But I don't push it all the way down before I squeeze some E6000 onto the sticky out bits. Then it can be pushed down the rest of the way and align all the edges. Now the area of this that has the divot is where the orb will sit, and the fins sit in the groove between the smaller half fins that are already attached. I put glue on the groove and snap the fin into place. Now I designed these to be really tight, so you may find you need to sand the insert in order for it to click into place correctly. I'm only attaching 3 of the fins because the orb will need to go into place before the 4th can be added. You can use the 3D print of the orb if you want, but since I'm going to make one out of resin in a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and attach the shaft pieces. I'm starting with the bottom first, and the way these pieces attach to each other is the most complicated part about this build. Oh, and another thing I've done is, with a Sharpie, I've numbered each piece, and on either end I've put the number of the piece that gets attached to that end. This will just save me from having to think while I'm assembling. I squeezed some E6000 into the opening and inserted the peg. This peg does sit loose, so there is room for plenty of E6000 to act as a buffer so there isn't as much tension put on the small peg. Some E6000 is squeezed into the opening of the next piece, and some CA glue is placed around the end of the piece like so. The pieces are slid together and aligned, and then the zip kicker is used to cure the CA glue. Now the next piece will attach here like this, and this is where it gets a little tricky. For the staff, I'm using some aluminum conduit as support, which slides through the 3rd piece without a problem, but it won't fit into the other piece. The reason is, if the hole had been made to accommodate the conduit, it would make the walls very thin, and they could potentially cause the print to become damaged over time. So the solution for this is to take an 8-inch piece of 1/2-inch diameter dowel, and to this I wrapped 2 pieces of 4mm foam and a piece of 2mm foam. The end with the 4mm foam will insert into the piece with the ring nub, and the other end will insert into the conduit, and this will give us a solid support at the bottom of the staff without compromising on structural integrity. First, I applied a generous amount of E6000 to the 4mm foam, and then this end of the dowel is inserted into the piece like so. The dowel will give support while the foam acts as a shock absorber. Then, the 43.5-inch piece of 1/2-inch conduit will be slid over the 2mm foam and sit perfectly on the 3D printed piece. I again cover the foam with E6000, and I also use some CA glue just for good measure. Then the dowel can be slid into place inside the conduit. Next, I coat some of the conduit with the E6000 and slide the next shaft piece on, but before it goes all the way down, I add some CA glue to the ends. Then they can be pressed together and cured with zip kicker, and at this point all the remaining pieces can be added in order in the same way. Then the peg can be inserted into the top of the shaft just like the other pegs, and then the top of the staff can be glued onto the shaft. Now back to the orb. As I've said, you can use the 3D printed one, but since I'm making one with resin, I sanded the print, and I'm going to spray it with some filler and sandable primer so I can make it really smooth in order to make a mold of it. Now to make my mold box, I hot glue some scraps of wood and plexiglass together to make a reservoir big enough to house the orb. I'm making a 2-part mold, so in order to hold the orb in place I'm using kinetic sand. The orb can be pressed firmly into the sand, and the sand will create a nice bond around the orb itself. And I use the end of a Sharpie to press my registration marks into the sand as well. For the mold, I'm using this Alumilite kit I was able to get at my local craft store. I've used this brand before and it works really great for small projects like this. It's pretty affordable and it'll cure in 30 minutes unlike others. It's an easy 1-to-1 mixture, so I mix half and pour this into my mold box. I like to pour beside my object, that way the silicone will rise around the orb, and you won't need a vacuum chamber to remove bubbles for a project like this one. After that first layer has cured, I take the box apart, remove the sand, flip the silicone with the orb, add new walls, and spray the orb with some mold release, and proceed in pouring the second half of the mold. Only mix what you need each time because the working time is only about 15 minutes and it'll fully cure in 30. When I poured the mold, I made sure to leave an opening for the resin to be poured into. To make the orb, I'm using these 2 resins. The clear casting resin takes 10 to 12 hours to cure, so it'll be the one I start with and will make up the majority of the orb. The other casting resin will cure in about 5 minutes and turns white when it does, so that'll be the one I mixed into the first. They each have a 1-to-1 mixing ratio, so no complicated math is needed to figure out anything, and I've never mixed different resins like this before, so let's see what happens. I use rubber bands to secure the mold pieces to each other. You just want to make sure it doesn't change or distort the shape any. Once secure, the clear casting resin is poured into the mold through the opening. I mix the second resin in a disposable needle bottle, and then I insert this into the opening and squeeze some of the second resin into the first. Swirling and spinning the needle around from the bottom up through the mold will create some dynamic designs, hopefully. Now, my thought is this 5-minute resin will cure first and create some swirl designs, and then the clear resin will cure around the second. After 12 hours, I removed the orb, and this is what came out. We'll need to polish it up, but I can see swirls on the inside. But first we need to remove the edge of resin where the mold pieces created a seam. This can easily just be trimmed away with a hobby knife. Then I wet sand the orb with some 400 grit sandpaper in order to polish it. To wet sand, apply a little water and rub the sandpaper on the wet area in a circular motion. Then I repeated the wet sanding process, but this time I used some 1000 grit sandpaper, and this stuff is really fine, so it should polish up the surface nicely. It's still looking a little frosty, but if we give it a spray with some glossy clear coat, it'll shine up and we can really see the difference in the two resins, and even though it's not film accurate, I really love the dynamism it created in the orb. Now the orb can be glued into place and the fourth fin can finally be added to the staff. Now it's time for the final prep. First up is filling the seams with some glazing and spot putty. This can be applied generously with a palette knife, but make sure to wear a mask and work in a very well ventilated area because this stuff is toxic. Once dry, the putty can be smoothed by sanding it with some 220 on a hand sander. This does make a mess, which is why I've covered my work area. Then some spot putty mixed with acetone in a 1-to-1 ratio can be applied to the staff with an old paintbrush. Take care to avoid the orb, you don't want this getting onto the resin. What this step does is it will fill in any print areas which may be a little uneven or where some print lines may still be visible. Once it's dry, it can be smoothed with the 400 grit sandpaper. When it's all smooth, I covered the orb with some painter's tape for the next several steps. At this point, I'll spray the staff with 3 coats of a 2-in-1 filler and sandable primer. I'll let each coat dry for about 20 minutes before applying the next. This will just help us achieve that really smooth look we want in the end. After it's completely dry, I smooth the primer with the 400 grit sandpaper, and at this point you'll start to notice that the surface begins to take on a slight sheen, and any uneven spots will be visible and easily taken care of. Then I wet sand the staff with the 1000 grit. It's this final sanding step that will take the 3D print over the edge and make it look like the level of smoothness in the films. Now the paint job for this is the easiest you're ever going to find. All you need to do is spray it with a glossy black spray paint. And if you're using a cheap paint like I am, make sure to test it out before applying it to your prop, or it might mean that you'll end up having to do more sanding, and at this point nobody wants to do that. This was how mine was looking after 2 light sprays, and since the paint is cheap, I want to build up light layers of spray and not risk drips and runs. Finally, after 4 light spray layers, I could peel away the tape covering the orb, and to protect the paint job a little bit, I give it a light spray with the glossy clear coat. I want to keep it light because if it's too thick, it'll begin to look like a fake applied layer, and it has the potential to run, which would ruin the project at the last step. And like that, the Staff of Saruman is finished. I have to say, I'm really thrilled with the way it turned out. Creating the orb out of resin was something I was a little nervous about, but again, I'm thrilled with it. And the simple black paint job is accentuated by having the 3D print so smooth. It really looks like the lacquered wood in the film. And let me know what you think of this project. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, share it with all your friends and family. If you want to make one of these, I'll post a link to the files down below. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at House of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.